be made. The deeply personal decision about whether to terminate a pregnancy should be between a woman, her healthcare provider, and those people she chooses to bring into that decision. My own experiences with first a near textbook pregnancy and then a complicated one that nearly cost me and my daughter our lives, as well as other medical issues faced by my family members and myself, has taught me that providers take great care to inform their patients of their condition, their options, consistent with the standard of care and training required by their profession. Legislators should not interfere with that relationship. It is time that we let women and their providers make their reproductive health decisions the same way we do for other medical procedures. And I ask that we pass Senate Bill 733.
For what purpose does the senator from Henrico, Senator Donovan, rise?
Mr. Chairman, I rise to speak to the bill.
Senator has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will speak against this bill as an OBGYN and a provider of reproductive services. And I think in the legislature, as I compare it to other things that I do, it's always interesting to notice the aspects of talking points that people refer to when they talk about a particular bill as they persuade to their side. And we all do it, but I will say, number one, the very sad and challenging stories that were addressed by the senior senator from Richmond are not actually involved in the aspects of this bill. There's a consensus in this body that ultrasound should be removed from the code as a requirement. I've spoken to this many times, that standard of care should not be included in legislation and law. But I think, Mr. President, that we lose sight of the idea that abortion, and to quote another, should be safe, legal, and rare. And, Mr. President, the aspects of the code that are being surrendered that would speak to that are, number one, the 24-hour waiting period. And I can tell you personally that there is a cost to a rash decision. We've said many times this is not like another procedure. This is a different procedure, and it has different emotional components to it. And considering a decision before you make it, I'll tell you frankly, I do all sorts of surgery, and I consent my patients usually a week before any elective surgery that they have. That would be completely within the standard of care, unless it was an emergency. And so I think that that's a very important point, but the most important point I want to make is that nobody is speaking against a woman and a physician making that decision. And nobody is speaking against a woman who has a very challenging decision to make while she is pregnant or for a child that has a complication. But that's not what this bill speaks to. And, Mr. President, I would encourage you to vote, or encourage the body to vote against this bill. Thank you.
Thank the senator. For what purpose is the senior senator from Chesapeake, Senator Cosgrove, rise?
Speak to the bill, Mr. President.
Senator has the floor.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen of the Senate, when people come to my office about issues that I'm unaware or uninformed, I use this analogy. If you want to know about F-14 or F-18 radar or weapons release control, I'm the guy to talk to. But if you want to talk about agricultural issues, I'm going to talk to the Farm Bureau, and I'm going to get their input. If you want to talk about medical issues, I'm going to go to the medical experts and get their input. All during the debates, we have heard that all of these decisions need to be between a woman and her doctor. A woman and her doctor. Again, a woman and her doctor. Until the bill got here. The bill's original form would have allowed a physician's assistant or a nurse practitioner to provide an abortion, whether there was a doctor there or not. A couple of examples when we haven't listened to the experts. We've listened to people tell us for years that the Menhaden supply had been dwindling, and it took another outside agency to impose a cap for us to say, oh, we better take care of that. A couple of years ago, we talked about illegal gaming machines, that they were going to proliferate all over Virginia. We said, oh, no, we know better than them. We're not going to do anything. Well, guess what? They're all over the place. So in this particular instance, during committee, we had Dr. Donovan, a preeminent OBGYN in the city of Richmond, delivers a whole lot of babies here in Richmond. We actually had an abortion provider that owns several clinics come and testify that it was a bad idea to have a physician's assistant or nurse practitioner doing this medical procedure. We also had a nurse practitioner who serves with us tell us that is not in their scope and they shouldn't be doing this. A woman and her doctor. That's what we've heard for years and years and years, until it's time to vote. And then it's going to be a woman and her health care provider. You know, we've talked about the safety of abortion. They always talked about back alley abortions. I won't yield. Talking about back alley abortions.
Mr. President, would the gentleman yield?
I will not yield at this time. Thank you.
Senator will not yield. Senator has the floor.
We've talked about unsafe abortion practices in the past, but let me tell you that passing the bill in its current form, where a, quote, health care provider can do this procedure, could very well cost the death of a woman who has gone to have this procedure done because there's not a doctor there to take care of an emergency situation. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen of the Senate, I have no doubt that this bill is going to pass. But I'll tell you this, we're making a really bad mistake to the detriment of the women of Virginia in this bill.
Would the gentleman yield for a question?
Will Senator yield? Senator Yield, you have the
Listen
floor.
to you. Am I correct in assuming that if this didn't have the nurse practitioner, you would welcomely vote for the bill?
Senator has the floor.
Mr. President, I'd answer the gentleman, hell no.
That's what I thought.
Yep.
For what purpose does the senior senator from Chesterfield, Senator Chase, rise?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to speak to the measure and against this bill.
Senator has the floor.
Mr. President, as someone who's actually delivered 4 babies and lost 2, I understand the junior senator from Richmond City's emotional anguish and very much can identify and sympathize. However, I do honestly feel that this bill is doing a disservice to women and taking us backwards. Instead of informing and educating women, we're telling them for 24 hours, you don't need to know the information in that ultrasound. Make a decision without having all of the facts. I thought we were about empowering women. I thought we were about educating women. This bill takes women backwards. It puts them in the dark. Why would we want to do that? Taking the life of a child? There's no going back, Mr. President. There's no going back. Thank you, Mr. President.
What purpose is the junior senator from Virginia Beach, Senator Kiggins, rise?
Mr. President, I rise to speak to the bill.
Senator has the floor.
I became very frustrated during my campaign that we were putting the pro-life, pro-choice debate with women's health care. Women's health care is completely separate, in my opinion. I, too, want mammograms and all kinds of screenings and everything we can have to provide our women with the best possible health. This is not an issue of women's health care. For me, it's an issue about education. Education is sometimes all we have, And that's what we can provide with these women. And similar to some of the other comments, we're taking away that education piece from women. We've made great strides, even in this chamber, just the past few weeks, with really promoting women and just the progress of equality and just great strides for our gender. But taking away this opportunity for women to make these informed healthcare choices is not the direction we want to go in. I never, ever send a patient for a same-day procedure, especially something that was as invasive and as complicated as having an abortion. So these women are in crisis. This is not an easy decision that any woman comes to, and I'm sure we can agree on that. We're not speaking even to the mental health piece that we are neglecting in this conversation as well. I see patients that come to my office in the primary care setting in tears and crying over the guilt, the depression, the anxiety that they have after having an abortion. And this is years later even to the same topic. So there's a whole mental health component that we need to at least recognize that probably these women will go forth in the future and possibly have children again. So when they are pregnant a second time or a third time, knowing that they had a child that they might have aborted and not being educated as to what they were doing is an injustice to women. Again, I am against the nurse practitioners being able to perform this procedure. That, again, the complications that may arise, I think you've heard many times that is not something that we should be in our scope. I just want to say one more thing. We were sent here to do the right thing, or at least I was. That's why I got up, I ran for office. I'm here in the Senate because I wanted to do the right thing. I wanted to do the right thing for Virginians. Sometimes we have to make choices that aren't the most popular with our party. We have not who gave the most money to our campaigns, but we make the decisions because it's the right thing to do. And again, this is our fight for life. We're fighting for people that can't speak for themselves. They're very tiny people, but they're still people with constitutional rights. So if we can't recognize that, then I don't know why we're here. So I respectfully request you vote against this bill.
For what purpose is the senator from Arlington, Senator Favola, rise?
To speak to the measure,
Senator,
Mr. President. Thank you. I would encourage my colleagues to vote for this measure, although I certainly understand the very passionate views of those who may disagree. I just feel it's important that we all recognize we are not removing any medically necessary strategy or practice in this bill. We are not changing standards of care. Things that are medically necessary are retained. What this bill does is it's, in my view, empowering women to take the information that's given to them, not have to deal with excessive information that is really more politically motivated than medically motivated, and allowing women to make the decision on their own. This bill, in fact, restores the dignity of women. When women, as you know, have a constitutional right to privacy, as was articulated in Roe versus Wade, the whole context of Roe versus Wade was based on a constitutional right to privacy. And that's what this bill, in my view, moves us forward with. It enables women to have the information that is medically necessary and then allows them the privacy to make the decision they need to make without values being forced upon them. I do hope this body can pass this measure. Thank you.
For what purpose is the senator from Lynchburg, Senator Peake, rise?
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to speak to the bill.
Senator, has the floor.
And I've listened to the arguments, and I've heard the arguments, and I understand the argument for women's right to seek medical treatment from her doctor. But the one thing that nobody really is addressing, other than my seatmate briefly, is society's interest in protecting the life of unborn children. There's no more monumental, drastic, or irreversible thing a government can sanction than taking a human life. When we were in committee, a senator I respect very much because she has such a different perspective on things. We were brought up differently. And that senator mentioned when we were speaking against this bill, I wish y'all would take that same attitude towards the death penalty. And I looked at the death penalty a little bit. I've done a little research on that. And look at how our society has progressed in the last 100 years and then in the last 20 years. Death penalty has a horrible background, racial disparity. People poor were not receiving proper representation. Through the 1900s, terrible, terrible record of what was happening with the death penalty. What happened? We evolved as a society. We decided we've got to provide counsel to everyone. We're going to make sure that people who are representing defendants charged with capital murder have attorneys who are certified by the Supreme Court to defend those types of cases. And not only that, do they get a court-appointed attorney who's certified, they get another court-appointed attorney who's local to the area. We have court-appointed psychologists to examine them. We have court-appointed investigators to investigate the crimes for them. We have court-appointed mitigators to raise issues for them. And you know what has happened? The death penalty has dropped dramatically. We've changed the laws on death penalty. So it's now much, much harder to get a death penalty conviction. It takes longer. They get automatic rights of appeal. They have last-minute calls to the governor, the Court of Appeals, Supreme Court, federal courts. We have done all those things, and currently there are only 4 people remaining on death row. And since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976, we started in 1982. There have been 114 executions in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Only 4 now remaining. We have evolved. We have progressed. And now as we have what has been called the most progressive General Assembly in the history of the Commonwealth of Virginia, we are reversing what we have done to save human life for the last 20 years. Government's responsibility, our responsibility, is to protect those who are underrepresented, who cannot protect themselves. And everybody avoids talking about we are protecting a human life. And we talked about that ultrasound and the fetal heartbeat. The senior senator from Richmond mentioned that. And each and every single one of you who has seen an ultrasound, who has heard that fetal heartbeat, knows it's not a fetus. You know it, and you know it in your heart. And when you talk about it, you know it's a living baby. And just because that baby is not wanted does not mean that it is not a living baby. It is our obligation to protect that. This bill does not. It revokes what we have done over the past 20 years to protect not just the mother by having hospital-type facilities, doctors perform it, but protect the life of the unborn. And that is our obligation, and that is why I'm against this bill.
For what purpose does the senator from Northwestern Fairfax, Senator Boysko, rise?
Speaking to the measure.
Senator has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let's get back to the issue at hand. When a woman makes a decision about her body, about when she is ready to have a child or not to become a parent, overwhelmingly in Virginia, people believe that she should be safe, that she should not be shamed, that she should have good health care. What we're talking about today is not debating the merits of whether abortion is the right thing or the wrong thing. We are discussing repealing provisions that have been added on over the past 20 years that shame women, that impair their ability to make their own decisions, that frustrate the ability for doctors to do their work. Medical professions should be
Mr. Chair,
professionals
or
should
Mr.
be able
President.
to. Mr. President, I do not yield.
Senator will
Thank
not
you.
yield. Senator has the floor.
We are talking about repealing medically unnecessary provisions that impede a woman's ability to make a decision for herself about whether or not she's going to have a child. with whom, and at what time in her life. I can tell you, as a mother of two, my second child, I also had a near-death experience. I did not know that there was a problem until we got to the hospital 2 months early. I had a doctor telling me that I had to make a decision about whether I was going to live or whether my daughter would be able to survive. Nobody in this room is qualified to make that decision for a family sitting in the hospital. And they don't have the right to make that decision for a woman who is struggling to decide that for herself.
What purpose does the senator from Roanoke County, Senator Suderline, rise?
Mr. President, will the senator yield for a question now that she's finished?
Senator from Northwestern Fairfax?
Yes, sir.
Will Senator yield? Senator will not yield.
All right, speaking briefly.
Senator has the floor.
I heard a moment ago this was about restricting or taking away restrictions that have been imposed over the last 20 years. And the question that I'd hoped to ask, because I couldn't recall the legislation over the last 20 years, was when we required a physician to be the person to perform this. That's not something that was done recently. This was not something that was done during a brief Republican trifecta. That was something that has been on the books as far as I'm aware, since it's been legalized in the Commonwealth for approximately 45 years. This is not something that is a restriction that was just imposed by conservative Republicans at one point. Yesterday, a substitute was brought forward that offered to address the very concerns we heard articulated in the introduction for this legislation. We've heard very clearly from the only physician on this floor and from the only nurse practitioner on this floor why we should not remove that requirement. Like the senator from Lynchburg, I've contemplated a lot on the things I heard that was said. And when this was presented in committee, we were told how safe a procedure this was. I reject that any procedure that always ends a human life is in fact safe. And I think that this is making it even less safe for the other person involved. Not because I have any special medical knowledge, but because I heard from the only physician on this floor and from the only nurse practitioner on this floor. And so I hope it'll be the pleasure of the body to reject this legislation that I think is politically motivated, not medically motivated. The other thing that I heard during the debate, it seems that people are having trouble saying this should be a decision between a physician and their woman. And a physician and the woman, that's where the decision should be made. People are having trouble stop saying that because I think that's what the other folks actually believe should be the case, even though this change in the law would erode that long-term understanding. And the other thing that was said by proponents of this bill that I thought a lot about, that I can't speak as eloquently as the senator from Lynchburg did, but was on the death penalty. And I would gladly change on any vote on that issue for this. And I welcome any conversation from anyone on that issue. And I think that I'm not alone in that position. So I hope it'll be the pleasure of the body to defeat this bill.
Do any senators other than the patron wish to be heard regarding Senate Bill 733? For what purpose does the senior senator from Fairfax, Senator Saslaw, rise?
Speak to the bill.
Senator has the floor.
I got here in 1976, and I think that was about 3 years after Roe versus Wade was decided. And we didn't see hardly any bills dealing with it until there was one in the late 80s that got killed. And then in the 90s, the mid to late 90s, maybe around even close to 2000, first came parental notification. And they put a judicial bypass in there. Then came parental consent. also had a judicial bypass. Then 2012, a bill was down in the House, and Delegate Byron put the trap law on the books. That was 2012. And when he came back here, it was 2020. Lieutenant Governor broke the tie. That was Lieutenant Governor Bowling. The following year came ultrasound. And when it originally started out, it was transvaginal, and even the Governor McDonald, who was pro-life, said he wouldn't sign it. Well, it just became a regular ultrasound bill. Then after that came 24-hour waiting period, okay? With the exception of the ultrasound and with the exception of the trap law, all of those bills that were introduced, and there were quite a few of them before some started passing, every one of those bills was put in by a man. Every last one of them. And, you know, Mr. President, I've said before on many other occasions, that if men could get pregnant, you'd have more abortion clinics in this state than you got Starbucks, and everybody in here knows it.
For what purpose does the senator from Henrico, Senator Donovan, rise?
Mr. President, I rise to speak to the bill.
Senator has the floor.
I'm a woman. I'm a mother. I'm a doctor, well-educated. This is a separate human life. Physiologically, genetically, it's real. Men may have put those bills in because that's who was serving then, but I'm here now. And I oppose this bill, and I hope you will listen to reason and science because we should be protecting this human life.
What purpose does Senator from Hampton, Senator Locke, rise?
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to speak to the measure.
Senator has the floor.
Mr. President, most of us here today, I think all of us here today, know what this bill is about. And most of us here were around when these medically unnecessary laws were passed. And we know that they were passed for one reason only: to shut off access to safe, legal abortion care in Virginia, not for health and safety or science or medicine, but for politics and ideology. Since 2008, over 170 medically unnecessary abortion bills and regulations have been introduced, and some have been passed into law with barrier after barrier that directly and inappropriately placed a politician between a woman and her medical provider when it comes to making personal health care decisions that profoundly impacted a woman's life and her future. As a result, these demeaning laws have impacted the most vulnerable women in Virginia and have disproportionately affected young women, rural women, low-income women, and women of color, women who look like me. Because of these restrictions, many women in Virginia do not have the ability to make their own timely reproductive health care decisions. The forced ultrasound requirement, the mandated 24-hour mandatory delay, which often stretches for far longer, and the state-based mandated biased counseling designed by anti-abortion politicians do intimidate, shame, and harass a woman who has decided to have an abortion. And that shouldn't be the case. When someone decides to have an abortion, it should be safe, affordable, and free from punishment or judgment. And who are we to sit in judgment of anybody? And the women of Virginia deserve our trust and our compassion. They trusted us with their vote, and in turn, we must trust them to make their own reproductive health care decisions, free from political interference as they have asked. We know that these restrictions and policies have been rooted in politics and ideology rather than best medical practice and patient safety, and they do not reflect the views of the vast majority of the medical community or the principles and values of the majority of Virginians who trust a woman to make her own personal health care decisions. Leading medical organizations such as the American Medical Association, American Medical Women's Association, and the American Public Health Association oppose these restrictions and have stated that they inappropriately interfere with the healthcare professional and the patient relationship, and they support this bill that overturns these medically unnecessary laws. For many years after Virginia became the laughingstock nationally for proposing a transvaginal ultrasound, yes, we were on Saturday Night Live and The Late Show, which transformed to the transabdominal ultrasound. I have proposed legislation to repeal that legislation. Now, I sit on the Education and Health Committee and witnessed the vote on proposing the repeal. Now, I'm baffled that proposing that repeal always ended in a party line vote. So I want to know what happened to individuals who sit here on this floor today and say that they oppose repealing ultrasound in the code. I'm also perplexed by the notion that somehow some on this floor think that women are stupid and are incapable of making decisions for themselves and cannot make right choices for themselves. I'm just perplexed and baffled by this. In this new year and in this new decade, let's do what the overwhelming majority of Virginians sent us here to do. They sent us here to right the wrongs of the past, to turn the tide on those politically motivated laws that are degrading and harmful to them, their families, and their health. In 2020, let's finally put Virginia's health and safety first by ensuring that every Virginian has the ability to make the best decisions for themselves, their family, and their health, and is able to determine their own destiny, not politicians, without interference from us legislators. Let's pass Senate Bill 733. Thank you, Mr. President.
For what purpose does the senior senator from Chesterfield, Senator Chase, rise?
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to speak against this bill.
Senator has the floor.
Mr. President, I would argue today we're talking about a life, not an inconvenience. Who is representing the baby? We have more sympathy for those who sit on death row and their feeling of pain from lethal injections than we do from a baby that can feel pain at 20 weeks. There are some in this room that apparently have more sympathy for those on death row than they do the unborn who feel that pain at 20 weeks. Who's representing the voice of the unborn? Mr. President, I plan to be that voice today, and I plan to speak against this bill that destroys life. And once you take the life of a child, there is no going back. This bill jeopardizes the very safety of the women that it says it's going to protect. There's even been a documented movie out there called Unplugged, which I've watched, where it talks about the leaders of Planned Parenthood and the atrocities that were performed and them not being prepared to handle the unexpected complications that can occur from abortion, women bleeding out, women dying. If you're going to advocate for abortion, which I don't support, at least be honest about it and support doing so in a safe way. This bill does not do that. Thousands of women are going to die as a result of the bill, and the blood of their hands is going to be on those who support it. Thank you.
What purpose does the senator from Northern Fairfax, Senator Howe, rise?
Speaking in favor of the bill.
Senator has the floor.
I'm one of the few people here who's old enough to remember what it was like before Roe v. Wade was passed. And I would like to just comment that I'm sure those who've spoken against this bill also oppose the whole concept of Roe v. Wade, because that's what they've run their campaigns on. But let me refresh my own mind, because it's all so sad, is what happened to some friends of mine before Roe v. Wade. I had one friend in high school who got pregnant. She asked us, me and another friend, what could she do? And we didn't know. We didn't know. We were the nice girls. We didn't know about such things. But what we quickly found out was there was nothing she could do legally, so my friend killed herself. I had another friend, this was in college, who got pregnant. We were in a small town, a small college. She had to go to a back alley abortionist who used all sorts of filthy things for the abortion. And my friend got a horrible infection, had to have operations, and was never able to have children. I had another friend, a young man, who got a girl pregnant and did the right thing and married her, but he didn't love her. And he didn't particularly love the child, actually, either. So all in all, it was a terrible situation. So then we got Roe v. Wade, and people had choices. They didn't have to put up with the tragedies that my friends experienced. And I'll be darned if I'll ever let us go back to those days. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank the senator. For what purpose does the senator from Franklin County, Senator Stanley, rise?
Thank you, Mr. President. Speak against the measure.
Senator has the floor.
Mr. President, members of the Senate, as you know, I've been an attorney for 25 years. So logic has a lot to do with the decisions I make. And as I've learned as an attorney through the time that I have spent before the bar representing those that could not represent themselves, those that needed help, to help them with their humanity, I've also learned to intertwine, without conflict, faith, my principles, with common sense. Because if you don't have faith, then you don't have a foundation. And if you don't have principles, then you stand for nothing. The ladies and gentlemen on this side of this chamber who oppose this legislation, or who might have even supported the legislation that you now seek to repeal, did not do so out of some political agenda to put a politician in between a woman and her doctor. Absolutely not. Why do you say that? Well, 20 years ago, informed consent and gestational development were passed. 2001. Well, that just doesn't make any sense, 24-hour waiting period. We heard from those in the medical profession on this side of the aisle that no procedure is ever done just then when a diagnosis or a decision is made. But on top of that, we had a court look at these issues. In the court case of Falls Church Medical Center versus Oliver, it was a 10-day federal trial in May. Witnesses after witnesses gave testimony in great detail about the scheduling and length and time with the patients. And after that, the plaintiff was entirely unable to convince a federal court here that a 24-hour waiting period was an unreasonable hardship, or as the court said, harmed or impeded the access of that person to obtain an abortion. So this 24-hour waiting period was not put in to harm women, to insult them, or to shame them. And certainly its effect, despite what you want to say, was not to impede or to prevent them from getting the procedure done if that was their choice. In fact, I've heard now people want this. We're standing in the way. Progress. But according to a Kaiser Family Foundation poll, which was taken this January, the 22nd, found that the majorities of Americans throughout the United States support laws that require women to wait 24 hours between meeting a healthcare provider and getting an abortion. 66% support the 24-hour waiting period. But no, the reason we're doing it is because we're shaming women. We're not shaming women. And listening about the transvaginal ultrasound, which was debated on this floor, and I do remember, contrary to the views of the senior senator from Fairfax, that 2 legislators who happened to be women carried those bills. One in the House, a delegate from Bedford, and one from the Senate who sits here in this chamber to this day. So we can always sit there and make these arguments that you hate women. You hate access to health care for women. It's a false front. It's a false flag narrative. Because remember what I also said, logic can come with principle. But when we argued that transvaginal ultrasound bill on the floor, which basically codified what was regular procedure, what was required, because in order to perform that procedure, the gestational growth period of development has to be discerned, because we remember from Roe v. Wade, and I've read the case many times, over and over, it says the first trimester, the second trimester, the third trimester. First trimester, access, right of privacy. Second trimester, states can regulate. Third trimesters, states can prohibit. It did not give a blank check. It allowed and balanced that the right of privacy was also balanced with the state interest of life, because there was a state interest to life. And I remember reading to this body an article from Planned Parenthood that said, we already do that. We do that procedure. We have to, because we have to determine gestationally how old the baby is, so that we fit under Roe versus Wade. So that's the logical part. That's the law. It's the law whether you like it or not. And these bills that have become law follow along that law. And goodness me, how dare we have to require that a doctor perform an invasive procedure like this? That's not trying to impede a woman from having an abortion. That's not trying to harm or shame her. That's actually ensuring that the procedure is as safe as it can be, even if we disagree with it. And now when the heart meets the mind, where my principles matters, ladies and gentlemen, is simply this. I do believe in life. All life. You've heard me privately say it, but I don't think I've said it on this floor today, but I'm going to tell you, I'm against the death penalty. Always have been. Because of my faith in the way that my parents, my father and my mother raised me. In the same way that I cherish life. And if you're going to consider life, consider it all. Not just one part. I know when it comes to the death penalty, it's because we don't get it right. Our justice system is never perfect. Never. Innocent men have died at the hands of government because our judicial system failed them. So in the same way that I cherish that life and that government has no right to take it, neither should we then. I'll close with this one thing, that where intellect, intuition, and principle intersect in my life. You may remember, if you sat in this body in 2014, I did not show up at Reconvene, and my good friend Senator Don McEachin stood up at the end of our session and said, "May we say a prayer for Senator Stanley?" The reason was simple, and perhaps you've forgotten, but my wife, who was pregnant with what would have been our fourth child, suffered complications. And we were in the hospital, and they came to us and said, "Ms. Stanley, your life's at risk. You should abort this baby." And she thought about it, even with the risks, and said, "We will not." And that day, on reconvene in 2014, when I was not here, our beautiful Grace was born. 24 and a half weeks. She was beautiful, fully formed, hair, fingers and toes. She was my daughter. And let me tell you, she fought for life. She fought for life for 3.5 hours like I've never seen anything on this planet fight for life before, and probably will never see after. Don't tell me that's a glob of cells. Don't tell me that's not a human being worth fighting for. And my wife almost died and was willing to give her life so that Grace could live. That's why I believe in life. That's why I fight for life. Not out of an intent to shame a woman or to keep her from access from her doctor. It is because I know and believe that all life is precious. Thank you, Mr. President.
For what purpose is the junior senator from Virginia Beach, Senator Kiggins, rise?
Mr. President, I rise to speak to the bill.
Senator has the floor.
Just wanted to address a couple other additional points. The senior senator from Fairfax and the senator from Northern Fairfax County, I always appreciate their history lessons, but I don't think this is always about Roe versus Wade. This is the year 2020, and I feel like we've come a long way. Although I don't have names of patients and patient privacy issue to list the stories and the people that I've treated for, again, the mental health crisis and the depression, I too have had a patient that committed suicide over guilt of having abortion 20 years prior. So I think the suicide issue and the mental health issue, both sides. This is not about shaming women. It's not about taking away their quality health care. It's a time where we need to be supporting women with the crisis that they're in. There's other options out there. I don't think we've even discussed them today. There's adoption. There's better birth control, better access to birth control. There's prevention. There's lots of other things that I think we need to really be focusing on. So we need to allow women that are in this crisis, that 24-hour waiting period. It's sometimes the only thing we can give them. Let's arm them with the facts. And I, again, advise you to vote against this bill.
Calling the senior senator from Richmond City, Senator McClellan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Speaking to the bill.
Senator has the floor.
While I respect the beliefs of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, including the two medical professionals, there are other medical professionals that we heard from, at least two doctors who testified. Not everyone who wanted to testify was able, because I think we have heard this bill before. The American College of Obstetrics and Gynecologists, who sent a letter to the chair of the committee, who specifically spoke on the fact that nurse practitioners and physician assistants, even though they're no longer in this bill, do possess the clinical and counseling skills necessary to perform first trimester abortions. 15 other states allow that. And in fact, we train nurse practitioners and physician assistants in Virginia to perform early term abortions which they do in other states. I did talk to medical professionals, in addition to the ones mentioned. At least 2 physicians who work in the same practice as one who disagrees. So, a couple other points I want to make. The senator from Henrico said that the stories that I told you wouldn't have been impacted by this bill, but they would have. At least 2 of them had their abortion early. They would have had to have an ultrasound. Even under the amendment yesterday, they would have still had to be asked if they had an ultrasound, if they wanted to see it. And as a matter of fact, I have another friend who did suffer fetal demise after the ultrasound bill was passed and had that very same thing happen to her. Over 50% of women who have abortions are already mothers. This is not a decision they make lightly and immediately go to have the procedure. And there's a wide variety of reasons why they make this decision. I can't imagine having to make that decision myself. I don't know what I'd do. But I'm not going to put my thoughts, my value sets, my beliefs, and presume to tell them that I know better than they do. This bill will not prohibit anyone, any provider, from giving informed consent. They do it in every other medical procedure done where it's in the standard of care without that being mandated in the code. It'll be no different here. And I'll just end on this. I remember, those of you who know me well know that whenever something happens, I research what could possibly happen. And so when I got pregnant for the first time, and particularly the second time when I had a high-risk pregnancy, I did what everybody tells you not to do. I read online everything that could go wrong. Everything. Everything. And I will tell you that if some of the things that could have gone wrong did, and I had to make the decision, like Senator Stanley's wife did, about whether to terminate the pregnancy or not, I don't know what I'd do. But if I made that decision after agonizing over it, if I had to get an ultrasound again and then go back home and wait another 24 hours, and I'm lucky because I'm less than 2 miles from where I could get a procedure. But imagine if I lived in some parts of our state where it takes a full day off of work, arranging transportation to come in and get an ultrasound that's not necessary, then go back home, and then come back and do it again. I just can't imagine. I can't imagine what I would do. But I wouldn't want my choice taken away. The provisions that SB 733 remove from our law, the consensus in the medical community is they're not medically necessary. The consensus in many of our medical communities is that they put barriers in the way that could stretch that 24-hour waiting period longer and put abortion out of reach for many women, regardless of the circumstances. For some women now, it's already out of reach, whether it's legal or not. Let's remove the medically unnecessary requirements, leave it to the standard of care, and leave it to these women to make the decision that is best for them and their family. Thank you, Mr. President.
The question is, shall Senate Bill 733 pass? All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote? Clerk, close the roll.
Ayes 20, noes 20.
Ayes 20, noes 20. The chair votes aye. Senate Bill 733 passes.
Senate Bill 160,